So, Lachlan, let's start with your piece about no labels. For those people who have not been following no labels, what exactly is no labels?
So this was a group that was founded in 2010, and it's led by folks it's essentially a centrist organization. They feel that the country is too partisan, and both sides need to sort of come together and figure out bipartisan compromises to the nation's most pressing issues. So it's certainly a mission statement that a lot of Americans would probably find themselves in agreement with. But it's sort of an insidery group that, when we wrote about them last week, was sort of turning its attention more towards the kind of bare-knuckled politics that you'd expect of more partisan organizations.
All right, yeah, and before we get to that, I want to just explore this concept of it's a centrist group. I mean, what does that mean? Do they have no? I mean, and I want to cop to having an idea of the answer of this, or at least an idea in my head, having been familiar with their work over the past 8 years. But they say they're centrist. Like, what, aside from the idea that they want, and I put this in quotations, bipartisan solutions, what does that mean to them?
Well, they have over the years put out some policy proposals, but this idea of centrism, I think, is more about sort of style than substance. In other words, the end product in terms of policy is perhaps less important than the goal of bringing both sides together to achieve that policy. So they would certainly argue that there is they're not an ideological group in the sense of wanting policies that align with one side or the other. But that leaves a number of people wondering sort of what they do stand for. And, like I said, they're really more focused on the process than they are on the outcome, which, depending on who you ask, could be a good thing or a bad thing. But it's not a policy group in the traditional sense. It's more of a group that wants to, if you want to put it generously, sort of mend the political process and the intense partisanship that has sort of taken over the last number of years.
But, based upon your reporting, and where people sit, are they really devoid of any desired policy outcomes? If the idea is it's just about process, that would mean that there would be no solution, or I should say no landing that they would have a problem with as long as it actually passed, right? Because if we're talking about the center, right, we could theoretically look at the polling and say, okay, where is, 60 to 80% of the American public on a set of different issues, and they're going to take those issues, right? I'm just always been befuddled by the terms that we use. Left and right, we're not really talking, represent a certain set of ideologies. Centrist it doesn't seem to be necessarily positioned in between those. It just seems to be like a different set of ideologies, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think they would say that, one of their selling points is they don't ask their supporters or the people they court to give up their policy preferences. But I think the central sort of conceit of no labels and this sort of centrist movement more broadly is a failure to recognize that there are deep-seated ideological and policy differences on both sides of the aisle. In other words, it's not just folks fighting because they enjoy fighting or because they, for political or rhetorical reasons, can't find it in themselves to give an inch to the other side. It's the I would argue very real and substantive differences, between the outcomes that whether it's Democrats and Republicans or conservatives and progressives want to see come out of the political process. So they are sort of putting the cart before the horse, in my opinion. And I think addressing policy issues in a centrist way, you're going to be hard pressed to solve a number of policy issues because the divide is so stark.
Right, and we'll talk about their success or failure rate in a moment. But one of the great things that you and Sam Stein did through your reporting is let us know who they wanted to fund them and who actually ended up funding them. And,
Sure.
Certain caucuses, I imagine, the Freedom Caucus, if you were to look at them in the, in the Republican Party, you would find a certain ilk of donors. Same maybe with the Progressive Caucus on the Democratic side. How would you characterize the group of people that No Labels is seeking funding from and gets funding from?
Well, just to sort of break down the precise information we got a hold of, we got a list of actual donors to No Labels itself, which is a 501c4 dark money nonprofit. And then we got a list of people who the group wanted to approach and did approach to pitch them on funding one of 6 super PACs that were formed last year for this election cycle. So in terms of the people who actually did donate to the organization, to the C4, it was basically a who's who of hedge funds, private equity folks, a number of other Fortune 500 executives. And these are the types of folks who very often this sort of centrist language is catnip for, who come from a business background and maybe see that sort of process and the ability to work through differences in a business environment as something that they would like to see sort of imported into the political system, when obviously it's nowhere near that simple for some of the ideological division reasons that I mentioned earlier. It was a little different on the super PAC side among the folks that they approached to fund those. These were names that, casual followers of the political process will most likely recognize. Folks like David Koch, the major libertarian funder, Michael Bloomberg, former New York City mayor, potential presidential candidate, Peter Thiel, major Trump supporter, spoke at the Republican convention in 2016, Ari Emanuel, the famous Hollywood agent. So these are very, very big names. Most of the folks who they approached, at least according to the FEC records we saw, did not end up giving. But it was a much broader spectrum ideologically of donors, which we thought was really interesting. They're fighting partisanship, and here they are approaching donors who for years have really bankrolled some of the most partisan groups and political figures out there.
Do they have any non-super wealthy people in their constituency? I mean, do they appeal? Have they ever received a small donation?
You can actually go and look that up on the FEC website, which we did, and we found that they've gotten almost nothing on the super PAC side in terms of small donations. The average contribution was about $125,000. They had about, in the range of 40 to 50 contributors.
I got to ask you, did you just say the average contribution was $125,000?
That's correct, to their political arms, yep.
Okay.
So they were definitely going after, the strategy was not to be a grassroots political organization, at least on the super PAC side. Now, we can't know on the C4 side, because they're not required to disclose donors, what the full range of contributors were. But so, we can't say for certain what percentage was high dollar versus small dollar donors. But certainly the folks on the list we obtained were all, this was $25,000 and above. Was either what they were expecting to get or what they had already gotten from these folks, and very often much higher, up to closer to $1 million. So yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that they are definitely, their financial support is overwhelmingly from wealthy people. If you ask the organization, to be fair, they'd say, sure, of course it is. Or they might say, we won't discuss our donors, more likely. But they might also say that, our supporters, the people that we work with and we recruit and that we have in No Labels chapters all over the country are grassroots. They believe in our mission. They're not necessarily wealthy people. They just support a more sort of centrist approach to the process. But, when you have these donors' names on paper, it's very difficult to arrive at the conclusion that this is, if not a group for the wealthy, then it's certainly a group of the wealthy.
All right, Lachlan, we got to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the. I got one or two more questions on this because I'm super curious as to what it even means that they're going to fix. They're problem solvers. They're going to fix things in the context of politics. And then I want to get to what is clearly a problem, and that is that no one wants to be Donald Trump's chief of staff. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.